At Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the casualties are rising.
A soldier was killed, and there were several homicides involving military families. There's blood all over the bed, there's blood all over the wall.
Then we realized something shocking. He is a member of the Fayetteville Gangbangers, a swinging group.
They're having sex at her house, they're having sex in her van. There was sex parties, there was getting together with groups.
You're just like, what?
That opens up Pandora's box of potential suspects.
It was scary, it was terrifying. I couldn't take the pressure anymore.
It's manipulation at its finest.
That's trained killer type stuff.
6 deaths have stunned one of this country's best-known military bases.
The toll now stands at 7. How has this happened?
This is 911. We just received a call from there. Is everything okay? I need ambulance. What? I need ambulance. Please go. Okay, well, you need a police officer call. Don't kill my husband. Somebody what? I don't know if people can come back now. Okay. Yeah, no worries. I got kids in the house.
The call came in as a home invasion, where shots were fired by someone who entered this home in the middle of the night.
That part of town was known for being a military community where a lot of military families lived.
I notice a female walking out crying. She identifies herself as the caller, Joan Shannon.
Joan tells us that she was home that night with her husband, David Shannon. She was awakened by a gunshot. And then there was another gunshot.
She sees this figure standing over David, and then hears them running down the hallway.
She tells us that in the home were 4 children, all under the age of 15.
She believes there's an intruder in the house. We have our weapons drawn. It's very unnerving. There's a room to the left. We find 2 young boys asleep, and we escorted them out of the house to their mother. There are still 2 more children in the house, as well as a possible shooter hiding in the shadows. The door to the right is locked, and there's loud music coming from that room. You don't know what to expect. A young girl standing there. She tells me she's Elizabeth Shannon, and she's with her friend Vera.
The 2 girls are in the room with music playing. Didn't hear or see anything.
I escort them out of the house. But we still haven't found David Shannon. His wife Joan says that he was shot in their bed. We get to the master bedroom where we locate David.
It was a bloody scene. David Shannon had been shot twice at very close range, once to his forehead and once to his chest.
There's blood all over the bed, there's blood all over the wall. It's just awful.
There was no signs of any intruders. There was no forcible entry. It's weird.
At the house, we photographed everything.
We're looking for anything that could help tell this story. Near David's body on the floor, we find 2 rounds for 9mm handgun.
We discovered a couple of weapons. The murder weapon was not one of those weapons.
When we see David Shannon, we see both of those injuries were contact wounds. The weapon is placed in contact with his body.
It appeared to be very targeted. It definitely looked execution style.
And that's trained killer type stuff. It's not something the average person can do.
David Shannon had been in the military for some period of time. He had achieved the rank of major and was having a very successful military career.
When I met Liz Shannon in high school, I was there almost every day I got out of school. It was a real family vibe. David was very, very, very kind. He seemed like he had no care in the world of me.
David had met Joan in Rochester, New York.
Joan has a child from her previous relationship, her daughter, Elizabeth, and then 2 sons with David.
David is stationed in Minnesota, and then they left Minnesota and were stationed at Fort Bragg, which is one of the largest military bases in the world.
Now, Miss Shannon, she seemed like she was ready to party. She was the firecracker. But she also was welcoming. She was motherly. That's how she was.
The Shannons were well thought of in the community.
Who would want to come in and do this?
Joan was quiet. She was consoling with the boys. We conduct gunshot residue tests on Joan, Elizabeth, and Vera.
What this test will show us is who potentially fired a weapon or was close to a weapon being fired.
Both Elizabeth and Vera's test comes back as negative. Joan's came back more inconclusive. It did show that she had some gunshot powder on her.
That's not unusual if someone was close to a gun when it was fired.
Then I take Joan so I can check her for any blood splatter.
No blood can be seen anywhere on her.
Not in that situation, I would not necessarily expected her to get blood on her. Gunshot it sprays out. The blood from the head wound would have spattered back into the pillow. It wouldn't necessarily blow to the side. And Joan tells us that slid down to the end of the bed, didn't go over to where David was. At this point, there's no suspect. There's no evidence that a suspect was ever there.
I've covered a lot of crime over 35 years, and that kind of incident just doesn't really make sense.
Fayetteville police dusted for prints and spent the morning inside the Galloway Drive home of Major David Shannon.
There was a lot of attention to this case because a soldier was killed, and that was a summer where there were several homicides involving military families. And we're trying to figure out what is going on here.
It was a challenge to search the residence with the clutter and the disarray.
There was rotting stuff in the sink. There was piles of dirty clothes. We collected some electronics. There was paperwork with email addresses and what looked like usernames for chat rooms. And they went back into the master bedroom.
We locate some pornographic material, videos, photos, which, no big deal, until we take a closer look. The material was extremely explicit. We realized something shocking. Guess who was starring in the video? Joan and David.
We see that they're involved in sexual activity with other partners.
They're like, oh, okay, wow, this is, all right, I didn't expect that. These folks are into some unusual things.
And then you're just like, what? With this pornographic material of David and Joan. And it starts painting a different picture of this typical military family.
It became obvious that there were other people involved in these people's sex life.
That opens up Pandora's box of potential suspects.
Oh, it's one of them seeing somebody that might have a motivation for killing David. We asked Joan Shannon, Elizabeth Shannon, and Vera Thompson, would you come to the police department so we can get an official statement from you? We're dealing with family members, and we want to talk to these girls and this woman in a different kind of environment.
Elizabeth and Vera tell us that they did not witness anything. They were in the bedroom sleeping, music was playing, and that they wake up and the police are there.
Joan Shannon said that she awoke to gunfire and then noticed someone next to the bed who fled down the hallway. We asked her questions about the relationship between her and David. She indicated, hey, we have a great relationship, we're doing fine, we very rarely argue.
She's, asked about the pornographic materials that were found, and at that point she admits that they were swingers and that there were other parties involved sexually.
There was sex parties, there was getting together with groups. This creates environments for jealousy and rage.
The rules of an open marriage, at least for these folks, was have all the sexual activity with other people that you like, but you can't develop a relationship. You can't fall in love.
So Joan is asked, have you developed feelings for anyone? And very openly, very matter of fact, she says yes. She's actually in love with a man named Jeffrey Wilson.
Jeff Wilson is in the military and lives in the Fayetteville area.
And now we have a suspect. We have to find Jeffrey Wilson.
Today, more violence again at Fort Bragg.
Wives of soldiers from the same base have been killed allegedly by their own husbands, most of whom had just served in Afghanistan.
More information started coming in about the other military murders in the area.
Stress and the military culture, those were cited as the overriding factors in these murders.
We had 4 homicides involving military families. The difference we had with the Shannon case is that the victim was the soldier, was the husband, instead of the wife.
Any connection between these homicides, Sergeant?
Not that the Fayetteville Police Department has found. Certainly the last that we've had, Major David Shannon, was an isolated instance.
This doesn't appear to have any connection to these murders.
At this point, we find Jeffrey Wilson.
Jeffrey's married. Jeffrey has 4 children.
He is at home with his wife and kids, and it becomes immediately apparent that his wife has no idea what he's about.
We bring him in for questioning. He's not very happy to be there and not very happy to talk with us. But he does say that he is a member of the Fayetteville Gangbangers, a swinging group.
David would go on to online chat groups, and he had encountered BLK stuntman, black stuntman, Jeffrey Wilson.
Turns out David Shannon is promoting his wife's services to Jeffrey Wilson.
Detectives discover that initially Jeffrey has sexual relations with Joan at these swinger parties. But very soon after, they start seeing each other individually. They were seeing each other 3 or 4 times a week.
They're having sex at her house, they're having sex in her van. And we find out that Joan is enamored with him.
Jeffrey Wilson tells us that at this point, David was not aware that Joan was meeting up with Jeff. But 5 days prior to the murder, Jeff gets a call from Joan, and she tells him that David found out about their relationship, and he has barred her from seeing Jeff anymore.
Joan makes it clear that she wants to continue to see Jeffrey behind David's back. She was in love with Jeffrey, thought that he was in love with her, and that the two of them wanted to be together. A couple of hours before the homicide occurs, Jeffrey is talking to David online. Jeffrey asks about Joan, and David says she won't be coming out for a while. Within a few hours, he'll be found dead of 2 gunshot wounds in his bed.
This is really, really harsh and cold-blooded. What amounted to an actual execution at point-blank range.
We started thinking, is this a motive? Does Jeffrey want David out of their lives so that they could be together? Joan had a difficult life. She ended up in foster care at a pretty young age.
Before she married David, she was in a previous marriage, and she had a child who was Elizabeth.
So Joan Shannon was a single mom. She didn't have a lot of income, and during this period of her life is when she met David Shannon. He married Joan, and he adopted her daughter.
He offered her stability. He offered her a family unit.
But when a person grows up in chaos, after a while, that stability gets a bit stifling. And I think Joan fell in love with Jeff because she's used to chasing affection, and I think she was attracted to that repeat trauma from her life.
As we interview Jeffrey, we're looking at this love triangle. He's telling us that he and Joan had developed a close relationship. He was very honest about that, but he was also very direct with us that he was not planning to run off and create this new life with Joan at all.
He says, I'm just saying what I have to say to her to get sex on a regular basis.
Jeff is still our only suspect at this point, but then he tells us he has an alibi. So Jeff says he was working night shift. So we contact Womack Army Medical Hospital, and they confirm that he was working the night shift. So Jeff could not have shot David.
We really did not have a whole lot of leads at that point, and we're back to square one in our investigation. Joan is very cooperative with us, but a couple of days later, that changes. She becomes more uncooperative. She did not allow us access to the computers.
And she says that she's no longer willing to talk with us without her attorney, and she's gone cold from there.
This became suspicious behavior. It left a lot of unanswered questions as to what was her motive for not cooperating with us.
But then, information came in that completely changed the investigation.
We received a phone call from the mother of Vera Thompson.
Vera Thompson was the friend of Elizabeth Shannon that was in the bedroom when police came into the home the night of the murder. Vera's mother gave some information. She had heard that Joan wanted her husband, David, dead. It was a shocking turn.
We're able to locate Vera. And during the interview, Vera is asked about these claims that she had made to her mother. And she admits, yeah, that these are the statements that Joan had made. But then we get another surprise. Vera states that she does know who killed David, but it wasn't Joan. During the interview, Vera states that it wasn't Joan who killed David. But she does know who killed David, and we couldn't believe what she told us. She tells us it was Elizabeth. Vera states that a couple of days prior to the shooting, Elizabeth actually showed her the weapon, and they went to a construction site and practiced shooting together. Vera added that while they were practicing shooting, they even wore latex gloves, showing that this was premeditated.
At this point, we realized that our murderer could be a 15-year-old girl. It was a shocking turn.
Elizabeth becomes our #1 suspect, and we need to find her. But when we go to bring her in, she's disappeared.
When I first met Liz, she would laugh at me because she had a swag to her. She was always laughing, smiling, joking. I don't remember her ever having a problem with nobody. But over time passed, Liz started getting a lot more aggressive, a lot more fights. She was doing all these drugs, supposedly having sex with all these people. It threw me for a loop. I think personally, a lot of her acting out was she wasn't getting the mother attention that she wanted.
I think Elizabeth definitely felt like an outsider within her own family. Joan and David had 2 biological children of their own. So really, she didn't have a sense of belonging. But I think secondly, Joan's experiences from growing up and feeling expendable by her parents, that she didn't matter, I think Elizabeth would feel that way too. She was an afterthought in many ways for Joan. So it's just easier for her to say, hey, Elizabeth, do whatever you want. When David on occasion would try to enforce discipline and structure on Elizabeth, it's something she's never experienced.
And once David took over, she was like, man, I hate him. You know what I'm saying? He's sitting here trying to act like he my daddy, trying to tell me what to do. She started rebelling an awful lot. And I would think, like, what is going on when I'm not around? What else is happening behind closed doors?
At the Fayetteville Police Department, this board often displays the names and pictures of people officers are looking for. Missing from the board this week was a 15-year-old accused of killing Fort Bragg officer David Shannon in his home.
She's on the run, and she's a minor. We can't put her name out, so she could be anywhere at this point. We had been searching for Elizabeth for days, and we couldn't find her anywhere.
It was known on the street we were looking for. We had been to the normal places where she would normally hang out.
But then we receive a tip, and the caller stated that they believe they had seen Elizabeth at this trailer. We searched the trailer. We didn't find Elizabeth. But then we heard a noise coming from behind a futon. We pull it from the wall, and we find Elizabeth hiding. So we bring Elizabeth in, and we couldn't believe what she told us.
You have a prepaid call. You will not be charged for this call. This call is from an inmate at North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women.
My name is Elizabeth Shannon. When I was first arrested by the police, they took me to interrogation and they were asking me, did you do it?
Once Elizabeth began to tell the story of what happened that night,
I told them, me and my best friend, we were asleep at my house. I took the gun. I went to my parents' bedroom. They were both in the bed. It was scary. I was nervous. My heart was beating fast. It was a horrible feeling. I shot my stepfather. After the first shot, he didn't die, and I was like, oh my God. And it was like a reaction just to shoot again.
This 15-year-old girl went in there like an assassin and shot him point blank, contact wound to the head and chest. Somebody she called her dad. After the shooting, I took the clothes I was wearing, the gun, the box of bullets. I threw it all in a bag. There was a guy waiting on like the next street over. She said a guy who they didn't previously know called out to them. Elizabeth said she had a gun, a dirty gun to get rid of. And the guy said, how much do you want for it? She says, you can just have it. Gave it all to the guy. He took it. And I went back to my house. Me and my best friend didn't talk at all. We were just quiet until the police came.
this was a shocking turn. We had a 15-year-old girl confessing to cold-blooded murder. And so the question became, why?
They were like, well, why did you do it? So I told them, this is why I did it.
So after we located Elizabeth and we got her downtown, she gave a statement that detailed the truth about why this incident occurred.
Yeah, I told them that it was to please my mother. It was what she wanted done.
We were so shocked. It was her own mother who had her kill David.
My mother wanted him killed because she had fell in love with another man and wanted to be with him. And I think she wanted the life insurance policy. I didn't agree right away. Eventually I did without having the intention of actually doing it.
It was so much more important that she does her mother's bidding than really understanding the full consequences of what it means to take a human life.
Once I agreed to it, it got more intense because she started pressuring me to go through with the actual crime. She was like, even if something happens, you won't go to prison, you're a juvenile, I'll protect you.
To go and say, it's better if you get caught than me. And nothing will really happen to you if you get caught. It'll be all right. That's a special kind of twisted.
I told the police, like, while asking me to commit the crime, she started showing me attention. She started showing me affection. She would come get me and be like, let's go shopping.
Joan would start to lavish attention on Elizabeth, and this is not something that is common between the two of them. And so I think Elizabeth started to crave that feeling.
Joan would allow Elizabeth to sneak out with friends. She was doting on Elizabeth, so there certainly was a significant change.
I was like, oh, my mom loves me now. She sees me now. She started acknowledging me and like saying I love you all the time, which she had never really done before.
Joan knew that no matter how poor their relationship got, that the minute she would say, but I love you and I adore you, that would have such a powerful effect.
It really is a sickening element of this case between Joan and Elizabeth, because the reason Joan is doing this is so she can manipulate her into killing David Shannon.
She actually, one day after school, brought me a loaded gun and a box of bullets and was like, you need to learn how to shoot. She put it in a drawer in my bedroom. Every day for like a week prior to the crime, she was pressuring me anytime she could get me alone that it needed to be done as soon as possible. I didn't have anybody to turn to.
The time passed, the whole atmosphere in the house ended up changing. You ever walk into a room and you could tell something just isn't right? That's how that felt.
I couldn't take the pressure anymore. I didn't feel like I had a choice. She told me that evening that it needed to be done today and that I needed to do it. That night, my mother knew I was coming. She had the blanket wrapped around her because she didn't want any blood or anything to get on her.
This explained why we didn't find any blood on Joan after the shooting. We just couldn't believe it.
After I did it and went back into the house, she was on the phone crying with the 911 operator, acting like somebody broke in.
Yeah, she was not like that when I got there. She was crying, but there were no tears. Apparently, she could switch that on and off.
Acting is really what was going on. I was kind of in a state of shock afterwards, and I knew pretty much at that point that I had messed up my own life.
When Elizabeth signed her statement, she put a little heart over the I, and I think that it's interesting because it shows that really, at the core, her mental state is still that of a child. But she's also a murderer, and unfortunately, she is the one who chose to follow through with her mother's pleas.
Joan was staying at the Fisher House, which is like a bed and breakfast kind of thing on Fort Bragg, and everyone was quite shocked when I came in with the military police. That was how she was arrested. And Joan had a very stoic look on her face.
Elizabeth had confessed, she had admitted to the murder, but Joan took the complete opposite approach. She had nothing to do with this. Joan tried to invoke emotion within herself and kind of play the grieving widow. She was trying to avoid responsibility herself by putting all the blame on Elizabeth.
It was scary, it was terrifying, but whatever was going to happen, I accepted it because I knew I deserved it. Because I was a juvenile, I wasn't granted a bond. My mother, because she was an adult, got a bond set, and she actually made bail and was out and free leading up to trial.
David's family was so convinced that Joan was factually innocent that they came to Fayetteville, they paid her bail, and they took her back home while they were waiting for her trial.
She couldn't plan to murder a fly, let alone a human being.
This is the only time I've had this happen in almost 25 years of prosecuting cases.
Joan Shannon could face the death penalty if she's convicted for the murder of her husband.
I found out she was pretty much telling them it was me and had nothing to do with it. I was scared. I was angry because I felt like my mom had set me up.
It was just, my daughter did this, and if she has to spend many, many years or the rest of her life in prison, so be it.
Joan, did you kill your husband?
We had two people that were charged. Elizabeth had absolutely pulled the trigger, committed the murder, and she needed to be held accountable for that. But Joan Shannon was the puppet master. We made the decision that we would secure Elizabeth's testimony and that she would testify against her mother at trial.
Having a child testify against their own parents in a case of this magnitude is very unusual.
I remember seeing my mom at court, walking into the courtroom, and she wouldn't look at me.
Would she be able to do that? Would she stand up to it?
"16-year-old Elizabeth Shannon didn't say much in court, but what she said caught everyone's attention.
Are you in fact guilty of each of those separate offenses?
Shannon admitted killing her stepfather. In doing so, she avoided a possible life sentence.
Elizabeth pled guilty to conspiracy to commit first-degree murder as well as second-degree murder. She was sentenced to no less than 25 years and no more than 31 and a half years.
She was going to serve more time in prison than she had lived at that point, maybe twice as much almost.
Elizabeth Shannon said she was sorry, that she made devastating choices, that she'll live with shame forever.
I just remember being kind of like in a state of shock because I couldn't believe what I did and how fast everything happened after that.
Elizabeth was going to testify in her mother's trial.
I was waiting for her to say something or see or acknowledge me, and she never did. I was trying to talk to her, and her lawyer actually told her, "Don't talk to me."
Joan had been kind of looking down and avoiding looking at witnesses and avoiding looking at the evidence, but then her daughter came in. Elizabeth took the stand, and Joan kind of perked up and paid attention and was looking at Elizabeth.
Their defense was to paint Elizabeth in the worst possible light.
She was involved with smoking and drinking and underage sexual activity, and that David Shannon was trying to be the disciplinarian, and that she resented him for that. She hated him for that. She wanted him dead for that. When Elizabeth was on the stand and testifying, Joan would whisper things to her defense attorney, sort of ask her this or ask her that. It was really tragic. Once Elizabeth began to tell the story of what happened that night, she was consistent. This is what I did, and I did it at the request, the persuasion, and for my mother. When the jury came back in, you know, you're nervous and are holding your breath.
Joan Shannon stared into space when the verdict was read.
That the defendant is guilty of first-degree murder.
The judge gave the mandatory sentence, life without parole.
Total shock. Couldn't believe that this is the kind of verdict that was reached.
I'm just glad that Elizabeth didn't take that ride by herself.
I wasn't happy, but I did feel justified. I felt at peace. Once I got sentenced, I was shocked that I had to do so much time.
She's not no monster. She was just misguided by a person she trusted. It's just plain and simple. She was used and manipulated by her own mother. It's sad, man. This is just sad. It's just sad. It's heartbreaking to me.
I think the fact that Joan was able to manipulate Elizabeth in such a way. It just shows you how much power a parent has over their children, because at the end of the day, we all want to know that we matter. And I think that that's ultimately why Elizabeth pulled the trigger.
The case was one of my first, but it really has stuck with me through the years. It's just so tragic. David Shannon's life, an Army major, a father, a husband, was taken because of Joan's manipulation.
When I think back about my stepfather, we didn't get along, but he was just being a parent. All these years later, I feel ashamed and I feel guilty, and I wish I could undo what I did, because he didn't deserve what happened to him. And it's something I have to carry with me for the rest of my life.
She was a servant to her mother's every wish.
The first thought that came to mind is, what the?
That woman is accused of going to kill her boyfriend.
You're almost in disbelief.
She's the monster you read about.
You go shoot him, and then Mommy will be right here.
The night didn't scream. It didn't explode. It didn't beg for attention. It simply disappeared. On a quiet stretch of Texas highway in the summer of 1988, beneath a sky heavy with heat and cicadas, something ended without a sound. No gunshots reported. No neighbors woken. No alarms tripped. Just a car pulled over where it shouldn't have been, engine cold, driver's door slightly open, and the kind of silence that feels staged, as if someone carefully placed it there. By sunrise, the silence had a name. Cold case. The woman was supposed to be home before midnight. She always was. A routine so precise her mother used it to set the kitchen clock. Same road. Same gas station stop. Same coffee cup rattling in the holder. But that night, the clock kept ticking and the door never opened. By morning, her bed was untouched, her purse still missing, and the coffee cup was found hours later, crushed into the gravel shoulder of Route 67 like it had been stepped on in a hurry. Texas had seen violence before. It wasn't naive. But this was different. There was no blood, no body, no explanation. Just absence, thick and immediate, spreading through the town faster than the heat. Police arrived expecting a breakdown, maybe a drunk driver scare, maybe a lover's quarrel. What they found instead was a car that looked abandoned but not ransacked, keys missing, wallet gone, radio still tuned to the same station she always listened to on the drive home. The doors weren't forced. The tires were intact. The trunk empty. Too clean. Too deliberate. A missing person report became an investigation before noon. By nightfall, the words everyone feared but no one said out loud had already settled in the air. She didn't leave on her own. The town closed ranks fast. In places like this, secrets don't like daylight. Everyone knew everyone. Or thought they did. Neighbors were interviewed. Co-workers pulled aside. Ex-boyfriends, co-workers, cousins, men with priors, men without alibis. Everyone was polite. Everyone was nervous. Everyone had a version of the truth that stopped just short of something important. The first witness came forward late. Too late to feel natural. A truck driver who said he saw a car pulled over around 11:40 p.m. A figure standing beside it. Another vehicle behind, lights off. He couldn't describe the face. Only the posture. Relaxed. Like the person wasn't afraid. That detail stuck. Because fear leaves a shape. And whatever happened on that road didn't begin with panic. Days passed. Then weeks. Search teams combed fields, creeks, abandoned wells. Dogs traced scents that went nowhere and everywhere at once. Flyers peeled off telephone poles under the sun. Her name became a question mark on local news crawls. Still missing. No new leads. Family pleading for answers. Then came the first strange thing. A call to the sheriff's office from a payphone nearly 50 miles away. No voice. Just breathing. Slow. Deliberate. When the operator spoke her name, the breathing stopped. The line went dead. They never found the payphone caller. Investigators argued. One camp said opportunistic crime. Wrong place, wrong time. Another insisted this was personal. Too neat. Too controlled. The scene felt managed, like someone who'd rehearsed it. Someone who knew the road. Knew the timing. Knew her. The media circled. Headlines sharpened. Texas woman vanishes without a trace. Cold case looming. Community shaken. Cameras pointed at grieving parents. At empty bedrooms. At a mailbox no longer checked for her letters. And then, as often happens, the trail cooled. Tips dried up. Witnesses recanted or forgot. Evidence aged. Boxes filled shelves. New cases arrived louder, bloodier, easier to explain. Her name slipped from front pages to footnotes. From conversations to silence. Years passed. Texas changed. Roads widened. Gas stations closed. Payphones vanished. The town grew older, heavier with things it never resolved. Children who once helped hang missing posters grew up and left. Her parents aged in place, answering the same questions with the same tired hope. The case file gathered dust. The label never changed. Unsolved. Then, decades later, someone opened the box again. Not because of a confession. Not because of a body. But because of something small. Something overlooked. Something that didn't exist in 1988. A DNA profile. Technology had caught up with the silence. Evidence once considered useless. Skin cells on a steering wheel. A trace on a door handle was suddenly speaking. Quietly at first. Then louder. A partial match. A database hit that shouldn't have been possible. A name connected not to the past but to the present. A man who had lived free for 35 years. A man no one expected. When detectives knocked on his door, he looked confused. Older. Ordinary. The kind of man who blends into a grocery store aisle. No record tying him directly to her. No obvious motive. Just a genetic shadow stretching backward across decades, pointing straight to that stretch of highway where a woman vanished without a sound. The arrest stunned everyone. Headlines erupted overnight. Cold case reopened. Surprise arrest after 35 years. Justice delayed. Truth at last? But the truth was still slippery. Because an arrest isn't an answer. It's a question with handcuffs. And as the town watched this man led away, a deeper fear surfaced, one they hadn't prepared for. What if they had known him all along? What if he'd stood in line behind them at church, waved from a truck, smiled at their kids, while carrying the weight of a night that never ended? The silence from 1988 had finally broken. But what it was about to say would haunt Texas far more than the disappearance ever did. The arrest didn't bring relief. It brought noise. Sirens on television. Anchors leaning forward. Old photographs dragged back into the light. Grainy and unforgiving. Her face, frozen at 26. Smiling in a way that now felt almost cruel. Beside it, a mugshot taken 35 years too late. A man with thinning hair, a creased forehead, eyes trained to give nothing away. Texas watched and Texas argued. Because the question wasn't who anymore. It was how. How does someone vanish on a familiar road, in a familiar town, and leave behind almost nothing but a car and a rumor? How does an entire investigation stall for decades, only to lurch back to life because of a molecule no one knew how to read in 1988? Detectives went back to the beginning, not with nostalgia, but with suspicion. Old reports were retyped. Cassette interviews digitized. Photographs scanned and enlarged until details once dismissed as shadows began to sharpen into shapes. The night of her disappearance was replayed minute by minute, like a crime scene that had never truly been cleared. She left work at 10:47 p.m., stopped for gas at 11:12, seen alive by the clerk. Calm. Alone. Credit card receipt time-stamped, undeniable. After that, the road swallowed her. Route 67 was quiet at night back then. Sparse traffic. Long stretches without lights. A place where headlights could approach from behind and never be noticed until it was too late. Investigators now believed the stop on the shoulder wasn't random. It was prompted. A signal. A reason to pull over. A flash of lights. A voice calling her name. A face she recognized. That theory made the town uncomfortable. Because recognition implies familiarity. And familiarity meant the danger wasn't some faceless monster drifting through Texas. It was local. Ordinary. Someone who knew her routine, her route, her trust. The arrested man denied everything. Calmly, politely. He said he had never met her. Said he didn't remember that night. Said the DNA must be a mistake, contamination, coincidence. He had lived a quiet life. Married. Divorced. Worked steady jobs. Paid taxes. No violent record. No whispers following him. And yet, the genetic evidence didn't care about his resume. It placed him inside her car. That alone cracked the case open. Investigators returned to witnesses who were still alive, now older, slower to speak, but sometimes more willing. Time loosens loyalties. A former coworker remembered something she'd never reported. A man who used to wait in the parking lot, leaning against a truck watching her leave. At the time it felt harmless. Just another guy. Now it felt like a missed alarm. A neighbor recalled an argument weeks before the disappearance. Raised voices. A woman crying. A door slamming. At the time no one called police. Couples fought. People minded their business. In cold cases, indifference becomes evidence. The truck driver from the highway was located again. His memory had faded, but one thing hadn't changed. He was still certain the second vehicle's lights were off. Intentional darkness. Someone who didn't want to be seen. That detail lined up with something else found deep in the file. A note scribbled by a patrol officer in 1988. Almost illegible. Possible impersonation? It had never gone anywhere. At the time, police impersonators were rare, and there was no proof. Now the idea resurfaced with force. Because the arrested man had once owned a vehicle similar to an unmarked cruiser. Because he had access to emergency lights. Because he knew how authority sounded. The picture forming wasn't sudden violence. It was control. Compliance. A moment where she believed she was safe enough to stop. Still, there was a problem that refused to go away. Where was the body? Searches resumed with modern tools. Ground-penetrating radar. Drones. Old tips remapped against new terrain. Areas once farmland were now subdivisions. Places once empty now paved and named. If she had been buried, she might be under a driveway, a school, a strip mall. The idea sickened the community. People started to wonder what they were standing on. The suspect's past was dissected. Old acquaintances contacted. Former partners interviewed. Most described him as quiet. Some said controlling. One woman hesitated before admitting he frightened her once, years ago. During an argument on a dark road. He'd pulled over without warning. Turned off the engine. Sat in silence until she apologized. Investigators wrote that down. Because patterns don't always repeat loudly. Sometimes they whisper. The prosecution built its case carefully. Circumstantial, yes, but tightening. DNA. Opportunity. Behavioral history. The defense pushed back just as hard. No body. No murder weapon. No eyewitness placing him with her that night. 35 years of reasonable doubt. And hovering over everything was the clock. Memories fade. Evidence degrades. Death claims witnesses faster than answers. Every day that passed since 1988 had helped him, whether he knew it or not. The town split into camps. Those who wanted closure at any cost. Those who feared a wrongful conviction. Those who believed they had finally found the monster. Those who wondered if the real truth had already been lost. Her family watched silently. They had learned long ago that hope is dangerous. That announcements don't equal justice. That headlines don't bring people back. For them, this wasn't a reopening. It was a reopening of wounds that never healed. They wanted one thing. To know what happened on that road. As the trial date approached, a new detail surfaced, unplanned and unsettling. A box of personal items, stored for decades in an evidence room, was recatalogued. Inside, a cassette tape labeled only with a date. The night after she disappeared. No one remembered recording it. When they played it, there was no voice at first. Just static. Then breathing. Slow. Controlled. And then faintly a sound that made everyone in the room freeze. A car door closing. The tape cut off seconds later. No one could prove who recorded it. Or why. Or how it ended up forgotten. But to the detectives who heard it, the message was unmistakable. Someone had wanted to be heard. Someone had been close enough to record the moment. Someone had lived with that sound for decades. The arrest had cracked the case open, but it also revealed something far more disturbing than a single suspect. It revealed how thin the line was between ordinary life and something unspeakable, how easily it could hide, how long it could wait. And as Texas leaned in, desperate for an ending, the case refused to cooperate. Because some mysteries don't end when you find a suspect. They end when the truth finally stops running. And this one was still moving. The tape didn't make the case clearer. It made it darker. Because recordings don't lie, but they also don't explain. They preserve moments without context, sounds without motives, fragments that refuse to assemble themselves into something whole. The breathing on that cassette wasn't frantic. It wasn't panicked. It was steady, almost patient, like someone waiting for the right second to press stop. And that terrified the investigators more than a scream ever could. The defense moved quickly, filing motions to suppress it. Chain of custody issues. Unclear origin. No identifiable voice. No timestamp beyond a handwritten date. The prosecution pushed back, arguing relevance, arguing intent, arguing that the tape fit too perfectly with everything else they now understood about that night. The judge didn't rule immediately. Neither did public opinion. Talk radio lit up. Online forums resurrected rumors that had slept for decades. Names were typed that had never appeared in police files. Old grudges found new oxygen. Everyone remembered something now. A strange car. A weird comment. A man who lingered too long at the bar. Memory became elastic, stretching to fill the shape of the story people wanted to believe. Investigators tried to ignore the noise and focused on one question that had never changed. What happened after she pulled over? They rebuilt the timeline with forensic precision. Traffic patterns. Weather data. Moonlight angles. The road surface itself tested for how sound carried, how headlights reflected, how quickly another vehicle could approach without being seen. They concluded she likely stood outside the car for less than 2 minutes. Long enough to speak. Long enough to trust. Long enough to make a fatal mistake. No skid marks. No signs of struggle. No screams reported. Compliance again. A former state trooper was consulted, asked to describe how easy it would have been in 1988 to mimic authority. His answer was blunt. Too easy. Flashing lights. A confident tone. A badge-shaped object in the dark. Most people wouldn't question it. Especially not a woman alone on a rural road. Especially not someone raised to believe that stopping for police meant safety. The suspect's history was combed again, this time with a sharper lens. Old employment records showed brief stints in security-related work. Nothing illegal. Nothing disqualifying. But enough to suggest familiarity with uniforms, radios, procedures. Enough to explain how someone might convincingly play a role for a few crucial minutes. Friends were asked if he liked police gear. Some laughed it off. One didn't. She remembered him showing off a light bar once, joking about how easy it would be to pull someone over. At the time it had sounded like a stupid fantasy. Now it sounded like rehearsal. The absence of a body remained the defense's strongest shield. Without it, they argued, everything else was theory stacked on inference. DNA only proved contact, not violence. The tape proved nothing at all. 35 years had turned a missing person into a canvas, and the prosecution was painting whatever picture suited them. But the prosecution had something else. They had behavior. After the disappearance, the suspect had changed routines abruptly, sold a vehicle within weeks, took a sudden trip out of state, missed work without explanation, none of it illegal, none of it criminal on its own. But together, it formed a pattern of disruption that matched the timeline too closely to ignore. Cold cases don't break open because of one piece of evidence. They break because multiple small truths finally agree with each other. Then came the moment no one expected. A woman contacted detectives after seeing the arrest on television. She was older now, voice trembling, unsure if what she remembered mattered. In 1989, she said, she'd gone on 2 dates with the suspect. On the second, he insisted on driving. Took a back road. Pulled over suddenly. Turned off the lights. Sat in silence. When she asked what he was doing, he smiled and said, "Relax. I just want to see how quiet it gets out here." She made him take her home. At the time she told no one. It sounded dramatic. Embarrassing. But watching the news decades later, she felt something click into place that she had spent years trying not to think about. Detectives listened without interrupting. They had heard this story before in fragments from different mouths across different years. Control through isolation. Power through silence. Fear not by force but by implication. Still, none of it answered the hardest question. Where did she go? Maps were spread again. This time not just where she might have been taken but where someone would choose to take her. Places accessible from the highway. Places known personally to the suspect. Places that in 1988 were empty enough to hide something forever. One location kept resurfacing. An undeveloped tract of land he had access to through a relative. Back then it was nothing but scrub and dirt roads. Now it was partially developed, the rest fenced off and forgotten. Permission was granted. The ground was scanned. Dogs were brought in. Nothing. No remains. No clothing. No disturbance consistent with burial. The failure hit hard. Not just for investigators, but for a community that had quietly hoped this search would finally end the waiting. Each unsuccessful dig reinforced the fear that the truth had been erased by time and construction and neglect. The suspect remained in custody, calm, almost bored. He watched the proceedings with detached interest, spoke softly with his attorneys, never raised his voice, never showed anger. To some it read as innocence, to others it felt rehearsed. Reporters noted how rarely he looked at her family. The trial began without the one thing everyone wanted most: certainty. Jurors were asked to imagine a night they could never see. A road they might have driven themselves, a woman who trusted the wrong person for the wrong reason. They were asked to listen to experts explain probabilities, behaviors, patterns. They were asked to believe that absence itself could be evidence. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. Protesters held signs demanding justice. Others held signs warning against rushing to judgment. The case had become more than a disappearance. It was now a referendum on memory, on technology, on how much faith people were willing to place in science versus what they could touch and see. Inside, her family sat quietly. They had learned that trials don't feel like endings. They feel like reliving the worst moment over and over, in fragments through other people's voices. When the tape was finally played for the jury, the room went still. The breathing filled the space. The static hissed. The car door closed. No one moved. Because even without a body, even without a confession, even without a final answer, everyone in that room understood one thing with terrifying clarity. Someone had been there. Someone had stood close enough to record the end of a moment that changed everything. And whoever that someone was, they had carried that sound through 35 years of ordinary life, waiting for the day it would finally be heard again. The trial pressed on. But the truth, whatever it was, still hadn't decided whether it wanted to surface. And Texas was learning that reopening a cold case doesn't just disturb the past. It destabilizes the present. The courtroom never felt colder than when the jury began to doubt. Not out loud. Not openly. But doubt has weight, and it settles into a room the way humidity does in Texas, slow, heavy, unavoidable. Every raised eyebrow, every note scribbled and erased, every moment a juror's gaze drifted away from the prosecution's screen carried the same unspoken question. Is this enough? The defense leaned into that uncertainty with precision. They didn't need to prove innocence. They only needed to widen the gaps. They reminded the jury of the years, 35 of them, of evidence handled by dozens of hands, of memories softened by time and suggestion, of a man whose life, however unremarkable, had moved forward without so much as a whisper of violence attached to it. They spoke calmly, confidently. They pointed at the tape and asked why, if it was so important, it had been forgotten. They asked how a recording with no identifiable voice, no verified source, no forensic anchor could be anything more than a curiosity. They asked whether DNA inside a car proved murder, or merely proximity at some unknown moment. And then they asked the question that landed hardest. Where is she? The prosecution answered with silence, because there was no better answer. Instead, they turned to what had been learned since 1988. To behavioral experts who spoke about control crimes, about offenders who prefer compliance to chaos, who plan not for blood, but for obedience. They described men who collect moments, who relive them privately, who don't need trophies because memory itself is enough. Some jurors shifted in their seats. The prosecution reminded them that not all murders look violent, that not all deaths leave obvious traces, that the absence of a body doesn't equal the absence of a crime. They spoke of rivers of fire, of time itself as accomplices. They spoke of Texas land that swallows secrets without comment. Still, doubt lingered. Outside the courtroom, something else was happening. An old journalist, now retired, began rereading his notebooks from the original disappearance. Back then, he had chased the story for weeks before being pulled onto something louder, bloodier, easier to sell. Now, with the arrest dominating headlines, he felt an itch he hadn't felt in decades. One line in his notes wouldn't leave him alone. A tip dismissed too quickly. In 1988, a woman had called the paper claiming she saw a man burning something late at night near an abandoned quarry, days after the disappearance. The tip was vague. No plate number. No description beyond average build. Police followed up briefly, found nothing, and moved on. The journalist decided not to. He drove to the quarry. It was overgrown now, partially filled, fenced in places but still accessible. He spoke to locals who had lived nearby back then. Most remembered nothing. One man hesitated, then said he recalled a strange smell that summer, like burned plastic, that lingered for days. The journalist passed this along to investigators. They were cautious, but cold cases thrive on what was once ignored. Permission was requested. The quarry was searched. They didn't find a body. They found fragments. Burned debris buried under layers of dirt and time. Melted metal. Unidentifiable at first glance. Forensic teams worked slowly, meticulously separating what belonged to the land from what didn't. Weeks later, a report landed on a desk. Trace elements consistent with automotive materials. Clothing fasteners. A partial zipper. Buttons that matched the style of a jacket she was known to own, purchased months before she vanished. It wasn't proof of death, but it was proof of destruction. The defense objected immediately. Contamination. Coincidence. The quarry had been a dumping ground for years. The prosecution countered with manufacturing records, with photographs, with receipts saved by a grieving mother who never threw anything away. The judge allowed it. The balance in the courtroom shifted. For the first time, the jury saw something tangible, something that felt final, something that suggested not just disappearance but intent. The suspect's composure cracked briefly then. Not dramatically, just a tightening of the jaw. A glance toward his attorney that lingered a second too long. Reporters noticed. The community felt it. Because burning something isn't an accident. It's a decision. A step taken after the fact. A moment where someone stands over evidence and chooses erasure. The prosecution pressed harder. They revisited his movements after the disappearance. A receipt from a hardware store. Lighter fluid. Gloves. Items ordinary on their own, but chilling when placed in sequence. The defense argued again that none of it proved she was alive when taken there. Or dead when burned. Or even present at all. They reminded the jury that reasonable doubt doesn't disappear just because a story feels right. And they were correct. Because even now, even with fragments and patterns in behavior, there was still a hole at the center of the case. No witness had seen the end. As closing arguments approached, the judge reminded the jury of their responsibility. To weigh evidence, not emotion. To separate sympathy from fact. To remember that the burden lay entirely with the state. Her family listened, hands clasped, eyes fixed forward. They had waited decades. They could wait longer if it meant the truth was told correctly. The jury retired. Texas waited. Hours passed. Then days. Each update fed speculation. Each delay sharpened nerves. Commentators debated. Experts dissected. The public oscillated between certainty and doubt. And then, in the middle of that waiting, something unexpected happened. The suspect asked to speak. Not to the press. Not to the jury. To investigators. The room was cleared. Recording devices were set. His attorney sat beside him, tense but attentive. For years, he had said nothing beyond denial. Now he leaned forward. And for the first time since 1988, he acknowledged her name. Not with guilt. With familiarity. The tape rolled. Texas held its breath. Because whatever he was about to say wouldn't just affect the verdict. It would decide whether this cold case ended as justice, or as another unanswered echo, buried beneath time and argument, waiting for someone else to dig it back up. And everyone knew one thing for certain. Silence had protected him once. It might not do so again. He didn't confess. That was the first thing investigators realized as soon as he began to speak. There was no collapse, no sudden outpouring of guilt, no cinematic unraveling. What he offered instead was something far more dangerous. A narrative. He spoke slowly, carefully, choosing words the way someone chooses steps across thin ice. He said he knew her. Casually, briefly, claimed they'd met through mutual acquaintances years earlier, crossed paths a handful of times. Nothing romantic, nothing intense, just familiarity. Enough, he suggested, to explain why she might have pulled over if she recognized his vehicle. Enough to explain DNA. Enough to explain proximity without responsibility. He said that night on the road wasn't violent. He said she wasn't scared. According to him, they talked about nothing important, about life, about how late it was. He claimed she got back into her car and drove away. That was it. End of story. Wrong place, wrong time, bad luck that followed. Investigators listened without interruption. Then they asked him about the quarry. His eyes flicked away for the first time. He said he had never been there. Said he didn't know why anyone would think he had. Said Texas was full of abandoned places, and burned trash was hardly unusual. He shrugged as if the idea bored him. They asked about the tape. He smiled. Not wide, not smug, just enough to register as confidence. He said he had never seen it before. Never recorded anything like that. Suggested someone was trying to frame him. Suggested the police were desperate after decades of failure. He leaned back in his chair, relaxed. This wasn't a man breaking under pressure. This was a man testing limits. Investigators pushed harder, confronting him with inconsistencies. Dates that didn't line up. Purchases that matched timelines too closely. Witnesses describing behavior that mirrored his own. Each time he adjusted, clarified, corrected, never raised his voice, never lost control. That too was noted. When the interview ended, detectives sat in silence, replaying it in their minds. He hadn't admitted to killing her, but he had done something just as telling. He had placed himself on that road. The jury was informed of the interview's existence, but not its contents. Legal battles erupted immediately over what could be admitted. The defense argued selective storytelling. The prosecution argued consciousness of guilt. The judge ruled narrowly, allowing references but not the full recording. It was enough to change the tone, because now the case wasn't about whether he could have been there. It was about why he said he was. Closing arguments resumed under a different weight. The prosecution framed his story as an attempt to normalize the abnormal, to make a midnight roadside encounter feel ordinary when nothing about it was. They emphasized his language, the way he minimized, the way he controlled the narrative even now. They spoke about men who insert themselves into stories to manage them. The defense countered that talking wasn't a crime, that familiarity wasn't guilt, that a calm demeanor under pressure didn't equal murder. They warned the jury not to confuse suspicion with proof, pattern with certainty. The jury listened, and still no verdict came. On the fourth day of deliberation, the foreperson sent a note to the judge. They were deadlocked. The room went quiet when the announcement was read aloud. A mistrial loomed. Decades of waiting threatened to end not with closure, but with another unanswered question stamped into the record. Her family closed their eyes. Outside reactions split instantly. Some saw injustice. Others saw restraint. The case had become a mirror, reflecting whatever fear or belief people already carried. The judge instructed the jury to continue. Behind closed doors, voices rose. Jurors argued not just about evidence, but about what justice looked like when time had stolen certainty. Some felt the weight of the fragments, the tape, the quarry, the behavior pressing toward guilt. Others couldn't move past the absence of a body, the lack of a final undeniable act. One juror asked a question that silenced the room. If he didn't do it, she said, why does everything point back to him? No one answered. On the sixth day, another note arrived. They had reached a verdict on some charges, but not all. The courtroom filled again, tension thick enough to taste. The suspect stood as the jury filed in. His expression hadn't changed. Still composed. Still unreadable. The verdict was read slowly. Guilty on obstruction-related counts tied to evidence destruction. Not guilty on the primary charge of murder. Gasps rippled through the room. It wasn't the ending anyone had imagined. Not justice. Not absolution. Something suspended between. He would go to prison. But not for her death. The judge sentenced him to the maximum allowed for the convictions secured. Years but not life. Time but not the time she had lost. The gavel fell, and with it came a strange hollow sound, the sound of something unresolved being formalized. Her family spoke briefly outside the courthouse. They thanked investigators. They said they were grateful for effort. They avoided the word closure. Because closure suggests an ending. This wasn't one. In the weeks that followed, appeals were filed. Commentators moved on. The headlines faded. But something had shifted permanently. The case was no longer frozen in 1988. It was alive again, breathing, debated, unfinished. And then from inside prison, the man began writing letters. Not to the press. Not to the court. To her family. The first was returned unopened. The second included details only someone present that night could know. The third arrived with a single sentence, handwritten, uneven. You stopped because you trusted me. The ink bled slightly through the paper. And with that, the case changed again. Because trust is not something you mention by accident. And somewhere between the jury's doubt and the prison walls closing in around him, the silence that had protected him for 35 years was starting to fracture. Not into a confession, but into something far more haunting. A truth that wanted to be heard, but only on his terms. The letters were never meant to be read. At least, not the way people read apologies or confessions. They weren't pleas for forgiveness. They weren't explanations. They were control, stripped down to ink and paper, sent from a place where power should have ended but clearly hadn't. Her family handed them straight to investigators. The handwriting was analyzed, compared, matched to old documents. Prison psychologists read the language, the pacing, the omissions. They noted what he avoided as much as what he said. He never used her name in full, never described the end, never expressed remorse. He framed everything as shared moments, mutual choices, quiet understanding. You trusted me. 3 words that echoed louder than any admission. Because trust implies access, proximity, opportunity. It implies a door open voluntarily. And in crimes like this, that matters more than force. Detectives reopened the interview room. This time inside the prison. The walls were different. The rules tighter. He sat across from them in a jumpsuit that erased the last illusion of normalcy, but his posture hadn't changed. Still relaxed. Still certain he was leading the conversation. They asked him about the letters. He smiled again. Said he only wanted them to understand. Said the truth was complicated. Said the media had turned him into something he wasn't. When asked why he mentioned trust, he shrugged and said it was obvious. Anyone who pulls over on a dark road trusts the person behind them. The detectives didn't argue. They waited. Silence stretched. The kind designed to invite mistakes. Finally he spoke again, softer now, reflective. She wasn't afraid, he said. Not at first. The room went still. That phrase alone contradicted his earlier statements. A slip. Small. But real. You don't know when fear begins unless you were there long enough to watch it. They pressed him gently. Asked how he could be sure. Asked what changed. He stopped talking. The interview ended shortly after. But something else happened in the following months. Something quieter. More procedural. Prison authorities noticed a pattern. He requested specific books. Specific articles. Old news clippings about missing persons. About cold cases. About offenders who confessed late on their own terms. He was studying the narrative. Meanwhile, technology kept working. Forensic labs revisited the burned fragments from the quarry with improved methods. Microscopic fibers were isolated. Synthetic blends matched to a limited production run of a jacket sold in Texas in the late 1980s. Her jacket. The one her mother had described so precisely, down to the feel of the lining. It wasn't a body. But it was a piece of her life that hadn't made it home. Investigators returned to the quarry again, expanding the search area. This time they found something they had missed before. A shallow depression inconsistent with dumping. Soil disturbed and reset decades earlier. No remains, but traces of accelerant deeper than the surrounding ground. Someone had burned something there intentionally and cleaned up. The prosecution filed new motions. The defense countered. Legal back and forth dragged on, slowed by appeals, by procedural limits, by the reality that the most serious charge had already been decided by a jury. But the public pressure never fully dissipated. Podcasts picked up the story. Documentaries revisited it with sharper questions. Armchair investigators mapped timelines, cross-referenced letters, analyzed his words frame by frame. The case entered a second life online, where mysteries don't fade, they multiply. And then came the mistake. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't intentional. It was casual. In a monitored phone call, he spoke to a distant relative, complained about the cold, about the food, about being misunderstood. And then, without thinking, he said something that froze the analyst listening in. I already told them what happened out there. Out there. Not that night. Not the road. Out there. The analyst replayed the call, flagged it, sent it up the chain. Investigators compared it to his earlier language. He had always been careful to keep things abstract, vague, non-specific. Now, for the first time, he referenced a place as if it were shared knowledge. He had never officially described where the encounter ended. Detectives returned to him again, this time less patient. They confronted him with the quarry findings, the jacket fibers, the accelerant traces, the language slip. They didn't accuse. They invited. He leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. You can't prove it, he said. That was the moment everything shifted. Not denial. Not confusion. A challenge. They asked him if he wanted to explain, to clarify, to tell his side before someone else filled in the blanks. For a long time he said nothing. Then he asked a question of his own. What do you think happened to her? The detective answered honestly. Described a scenario built from evidence, from behavior, from patterns. A roadside stop. Compliance. Transport. An isolated location. Destruction of evidence. When the detective finished, the room was quiet. He nodded once. That's close, he said. Close is not a word you use unless there is a correct version. The interview ended without a confession. Again. But investigators walked out knowing they were no longer chasing shadows. They were orbiting something solid, something he was carefully keeping just out of reach. A grand jury was convened to consider new charges. This time built not just on absence and inference but on destruction, on control, on post-offense behavior that painted a clearer picture of intent. Her family waited. They had learned how. Years earlier, waiting had meant hoping she would walk through the door. Now waiting meant hoping the truth would. But truth has a cost. And as the case edged closer to another legal reckoning, one question began to surface more urgently than all the others. If he was finally talking, why now? And what, exactly, was he still holding back? Because whatever it was, it had survived fire, time, prison, and technology. And it was still very much alive. The grand jury didn't move quickly. It never does in cases like this. Too much history. Too many eyes watching. Every piece of evidence had to be weighed not just for what it suggested, but for whether it could survive the brutal simplicity of a courtroom question. Can you prove it? Investigators laid everything out again. The DNA, the letters, the tape, the quarry, the language slips, the pattern of control that ran like a thread through decades of behavior. They didn't promise certainty. They promised coherence. Sometimes that's all the law can offer. Outside, the case tightened its grip on the public imagination. The story had crossed a line from local tragedy to cultural obsession. People debated not just guilt, but responsibility. Had the system failed her in 1988? Had technology arrived too late? Had everyone, in small, ordinary ways, helped bury the truth by moving on? The grand jury indicted. This time, the charge wasn't murder in the traditional sense. It was a legal maneuver, precise and calculated. Abuse of a corpse. Destruction of evidence related to a homicide. Crimes that acknowledged death without requiring a body. It was controversial. It was risky. It was the only path left. The defense called it an end run around the jury's earlier decision. Double jeopardy dressed up in technical language. They filed motions immediately. The prosecution argued this was new evidence, new acts, a different crime. The judge allowed it to proceed. Her family felt something close to relief. Not joy. Not victory. Just movement. Forward finally. The second trial unfolded differently. There was no pretending this was about a missing person anymore. The language had changed. She was referred to in the past tense. The quarry fragments were no longer framed as curiosities, but as remains of a life intentionally erased. The letters took center stage. Experts dissected them line by line. The way he positioned himself as part of her story. The absence of empathy. The focus on trust rather than harm. They spoke about offenders who revisit their crimes not to repent, but to relive the moment of power. The defense tried to undermine this. Claimed overinterpretation. Claimed bias. But even they couldn't explain why an innocent man would write repeatedly to a family he had allegedly never wronged. The tape was played again. This time jurors knew what they were listening for. The breathing no longer sounded neutral. It sounded intentional. Measured. Present. A man standing close enough to capture the end of something without fear of interruption. The suspect watched the jury as they listened. Not her family. Not the speakers. The jury. As if gauging impact. Midway through the trial, something unexpected happened. A former cellmate came forward. Said the suspect talked in his sleep. Said he muttered about the fire and the place where it gets quiet. Said he once joked that some people disappear because they trust the wrong uniform. The defense attacked credibility immediately. Jailhouse informants were unreliable. Motivated. Desperate for leniency. The prosecution acknowledged the risks, but argued the consistency with known facts couldn't be ignored. The judge instructed caution. But seeds had been planted. The turning point came near the end. The prosecution called one final witness, the analyst who had monitored the phone calls. She described the moment she heard the phrase "out there," explained why it mattered, explained how language reveals what people believe is shared knowledge. Then she did something unexpected. She played the call. The jury heard his voice. Casual. Unguarded. Complaining. And then the phrase slipped in without thought, like a truth too familiar to hide. I already told them what happened out there. No explanation followed. No clarification. Just assumption. The room absorbed it. Closing arguments were short. Focused. The prosecution framed the case not as a mystery, but as a series of choices. To pull her over. To isolate. To destroy. To stay silent. To write letters decades later, not to confess, but to control the story one last time. The defense repeated their core argument. No body. No murder conviction. No proof beyond reasonable doubt that he destroyed anything connected to her. The jury deliberated less this time. When they returned, the suspect stood again. His expression had changed just slightly. Less confidence. More calculation. The verdict was read. Guilty. On all counts. The sentence was severe. Decades. Effectively life given his age. The judge spoke of accountability, of harm beyond the physical, of families robbed of certainty. The gavel fell. This time the sound was different. He was led away without looking back. Her family cried quietly. Not in triumph. In exhaustion. The media declared it an ending. But endings in cold cases are rarely clean. Because even now, even with a conviction, one truth remained locked away. Where she died. How she died. Whether she suffered. The law had spoken. But the story wasn't finished. Because from his cell, stripped of appeals and leverage, the man who had controlled the narrative for decades faced something new. Irrelevance. And for people like him, that is the one thing more terrifying than prison. Which meant the silence. The silence that had protected him since 1988 was under threat again. Not from detectives. Not from courts. But from himself. And the question Texas was about to face was simple and devastating. When someone like that finally talks, do you really want to hear what he has to say? Prison has a way of flattening time. Days bleed into each other. Seasons arrive without ceremony. Headlines fade. Names lose their power. For most inmates, that erosion is the punishment. For him, it was something else. It was loss of audience. The letters stopped getting responses. Podcasts moved on. Cameras disappeared. The world that had revolved around the case found newer stories, fresher outrage. And in the quiet that followed, something in him began to surface that investigators had been waiting for. Restlessness. He filed grievances, requested meetings, asked to speak with clergy, then declined when they arrived, asked for access to old case files, then complained when they didn't include what he wanted. It was as if he was circling a thought, unable to land. Then he made a request that caught everyone's attention. He wanted to talk again. Not to detectives this time. To the district attorney. No conditions. No attorney present. Just a conversation. The DA agreed reluctantly. Recording equipment was prepared. A small room inside the facility was cleared. When he entered, he looked thinner. Older. The confidence still there, but frayed around the edges. He didn't start with her. He started with himself. He spoke about control. About how people misunderstand it. About how it isn't about violence but about certainty. About knowing how someone will respond before they do. He said some people are predictable because they want to believe in rules, in authority, in safety. The DA listened. Then he said it. I didn't mean for it to last this long. The sentence hung in the air. The DA asked what he meant. He sighed, rubbed his hands together, looked at the table instead of the person across from him. That night, he said, was supposed to end, not disappear. End. The distinction mattered. He described pulling her over, confirmed what investigators had long suspected. Lights. A voice. Authority. He said she complied because she trusted the system, not him. He said he hadn't planned beyond the stop, that it was impulsive, that things went wrong. He never used the word kill. He said she panicked. He said she tried to run. He said he grabbed her arm. And then he stopped. The DA waited. Silence stretched again. This time it wasn't strategic. It was heavy. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. I didn't expect her to fall. Fall. A word chosen carefully. A word that softened impact, that blurred responsibility. But the implication was clear enough to make the DA's chest tighten. He described her hitting her head. Described the moment going still. Described checking for breathing and not finding it. His tone remained disturbingly even, like he was recounting a mechanical failure. The DA asked where this happened. He smiled faintly. Out there, he said. The DA pressed harder. Asked him to be specific. To name the place. To give coordinates. Something. He leaned back. You already know, he said. You just can't prove it. The conversation ended there. But it was enough. Because now, for the first time, he had described a death. Not a disappearance. Not an accident on the road. A moment where life stopped. The DA returned to her office and filed a sealed memorandum, documenting every word. It couldn't be used to charge him again. Double jeopardy still applied. But it could be shared with investigators. With the family. With history. Her family was informed in a private room. No cameras. No reporters. Just the facts as carefully as they could be delivered. He had admitted she died that night. He had not said where. They cried. Not because it was over. Because it never would be. Searches resumed once more, focused on a narrower theory. A fall. An impact. A location consistent with his access and language. The quarry was re-examined again. But this time investigators looked beyond it. They looked at embankments, culverts, drainage areas near where authority could be asserted and escape cut off. Months passed. Then, a construction crew widening a service road near an old drainage ditch stopped work. They had found bone. The location was less than 2 miles from where her car had been abandoned. Close enough to suggest she never traveled far. Close enough to make the decades of speculation feel cruel in retrospect. Forensic teams confirmed it quickly. Human remains. Partial. Weathered. But enough. Dental records matched. After 35 years she was found. The announcement was brief. Respectful. No sensational language. The family asked for privacy, but the story didn't end with discovery, because the condition of the remains told a different version than the one he had offered. There were fractures inconsistent with a simple fall, trauma that suggested force, not accident, evidence that contradicted his careful wording. The narrative he had tried to control was slipping again. And for the first time, the truth was no longer something he could shape. It was something speaking for itself. From the ground, where it had waited, patiently, for decades, the bones didn't scream. They never do. They simply told the truth, in the only language left to them. Forensic anthropologists worked slowly, reverently, as if speed itself might be a kind of disrespect. Every fracture was measured, every angle noted, soil patterns recorded. What the earth had hidden for decades, it now offered back in fragments, stripped of story but heavy with implication. The injuries didn't match his words. There was blunt force trauma to the skull, but not in the way a fall would produce. The angles were wrong, the distribution inconsistent. Defensive fractures in the forearms suggested reflex, not accident. The body had been moved, repositioned, not left where life ended. This was not a stumble. This was violence. The findings were shared with the family first. Always the family first. They listened, faces rigid, as experts explained what the remains could and could not say. How science doesn't guess, but it also doesn't offer comfort. It narrows possibilities until the truth has nowhere left to hide. She had fought. That single sentence settled over the room like dust. The prosecution could not retry him for murder. The law had already drawn that line. But truth isn't bound by verdicts. The district attorney released a statement acknowledging the forensic conclusions and formally naming her death a homicide. Texas absorbed it. The man in prison was informed next. Not in person. Through official paperwork, dry and clinical. The kind of language designed to strip emotion from consequence. He read it twice. Then he laughed. Not loudly. Not hysterically. Just a short, breathless sound that startled the guard outside his cell. When asked what was funny, he shook his head and said nothing. But the laughter was noted. Because laughter in moments like that isn't relief. It's recognition. The public reaction was swift and complicated. Some felt vindicated. Others felt cheated. The law had punished him, but not in the way people wanted. There would be no murder sentence. No final courtroom reckoning where everything was named properly. Instead, there was this. A truth that existed outside the verdict. Documentaries updated their endings. Podcasts added epilogues. Headlines softened, then sharpened again. Remains found. Homicide confirmed. Convicted man already serving sentence. Her name returned to the center of the story, no longer as a question mark, but as a person whose life had been taken. Her family held a private service. No body to bury in the traditional sense. Just fragments, carefully returned, laid to rest with photographs and letters and the jacket that never came home. They spoke about who she was before she vanished. The way she laughed. The way she sang in the car. The way she trusted the world to behave. The suspect was offered the chance to attend via written statement. He declined. From prison, he stopped asking for interviews. Stopped writing letters. Stopped reaching out. It was as if the discovery had closed something inside him. Or perhaps opened something he couldn't control. Psychologists debated it endlessly. Some said he had lost power once the narrative no longer belonged to him. Others said he never cared about being believed, only about being present in the story. Now that the story could continue without him, he retreated. But retreat didn't mean silence. Late one night, a guard making rounds noticed something off. Papers torn. Mattress shifted. A handwritten note left on the small metal desk. Not a confession. A map. Crude. Incomplete. Marked with an X nowhere near the ditch where she had been found. Somewhere deeper, farther, closer to the quarry than investigators had searched. The note was turned in immediately. Authorities returned to him, demanding explanation. He said nothing. Just watched them, expression unreadable. Search teams went to the location anyway. They found nothing. No remains. No objects. No confirmation. Some believed it was a final manipulation. A way to pull attention back. Others believe something else remained buried, something never found. Because the map wasn't random. It followed access roads from 1988. It marked a place only someone familiar with the land would choose. A place quiet enough to disappear into. The uncertainty reopened wounds. The family refused to engage. They had buried enough ghosts. Whatever else remained in the ground could stay there. Texas, however, wasn't done. The state amended records. Updated classifications. The cold case was officially closed, not because everything was known, but because nothing more could be proven. Closed doesn't mean solved. It means finished trying. Years later, the road where it happened looks ordinary. Asphalt patched. Signs replaced. Traffic steady. People pull over there every day for harmless reasons. Flat tires. Phone calls. Rest. They don't think about the woman who stopped because she trusted what she saw behind her. They don't think about the silence that followed. But somewhere in the soil beneath Texas, the truth remains layered, imperfect but real. And in a prison cell, a man lives with the knowledge that the ground spoke louder than he ever did. The case may be closed, but the echo isn't. It lingers, waiting. For anyone who thinks a story like this ever truly ends, time didn't soften what the ground had said. If anything, it sharpened it. With the case officially closed, the machinery of justice slowed to a crawl, but memory did the opposite. The story settled into Texas folklore, retold in different shapes, depending on who was speaking. To some, it was a warning about trust. To others, an indictment of how easily authority can be imitated, how quickly safety can turn into a trap. For investigators who had lived inside the case for years, closure felt artificial. Paperwork can end an investigation, but it can't quiet what you've seen. They still drove past the road sometimes, still noticed how exposed it felt at night, how little would have been needed to make someone stop. One of them returned alone one evening, long after retirement, parked on the shoulder, turned off the engine. Listen. The road made the same sounds it always had. Wind through grass, distant tires, insects pulsing in waves. Nothing about it marked the place as extraordinary. That was the most unsettling part. The suspect remained in prison, aging quietly. He stopped filing motions, stopped making requests. Guards described him as compliant, withdrawn. He avoided conflict, spent hours staring at nothing. Some thought he was finally broken. Others weren't convinced. Because people who crave control don't simply lose it. They adapt. A young corrections officer noticed that he paid attention when true crime programs aired in the common area. Not to the crimes, to the commentary, to the way hosts framed guilt and innocence, to the moments where uncertainty lingered. One night during a routine check, the officer asked him why he watched. He answered without hesitation. Because they still don't know everything. The officer wrote that down. It was added to a thin, quiet file marked post-conviction observations. No legal weight. No procedural value. Just a record of something unsettling. Meanwhile, advances in forensic science continued. Labs refined techniques that could extract information once thought permanently lost. Old evidence was reprocessed nationwide. Some cold cases reopened again decades after being sealed. Her case was reviewed once more, not for prosecution but for history. Analysts revisited the map he had drawn, compared it to satellite imagery from the late 1980s, old land surveys. Aerial photos taken before development erased certain landmarks. One analyst noticed something small. The X didn't mark a burial site. It marked a path. A route from the road to the quarry that avoided visibility. One that cut through brush no longer present. One that existed only briefly before erosion and construction erased it. The map wasn't about where she was. It was about how he moved. That realization reframed everything. Investigators began to believe the ditch where she was found wasn't the original location of her death. It was a secondary site, a place chosen for convenience after something went wrong. The quarry had been the intended end. The fire had been a contingency. Control disrupted. That explained the fractures, the panic, the improvisation. It explained why he never described the end cleanly, why his words were always careful around sequence. The truth, it seemed, wasn't just violent. It was messy. Her family was informed again, gently. that new interpretations existed. They listened, nodded, and declined further involvement. They had reached the limit of what answers could give them. Understanding how it happened wouldn't change that it had. The media didn't pick this up. It lacked spectacle. No new remains. No charges. Just nuance. But among those who knew the case best, the final shape began to emerge. Not as a single dramatic act, but as a series of decisions made by someone who believed he could manage outcomes, even when they spiraled beyond his control. That belief had defined him. In prison, his health declined. He moved slower, spoke less. When asked if he wanted to make a statement for the record, something definitive, something that might finally settle the case in the public mind, he declined. "No one listens the way they think they do," he said. That sentence was never released. It lived only in the notes of a tired official who had heard too many variations of the same thing. Years later, a small plaque was placed near the road. Unofficial. No government seal. Just her name, the year she disappeared, the year she was found. Someone left flowers occasionally. Someone else left notes. Drivers slowed sometimes, curious. Then they moved on. The plaque didn't explain what happened. Didn't need to. It marked a boundary between what was known and what never would be. Because cold cases don't end when answers arrive. They end when people stop asking. And in Texas, this one ensured they never would. Not fully. Not comfortably. The road remains. The silence returns every night. And somewhere in that quiet, the truth sits exactly where it always has. Not hidden. Not confessed. Just barely out of reach. Waiting for anyone who thinks certainty is a real thing. One part remains. And it isn't about evidence. It's about what lingers after everything else is done. What lingered wasn't the crime. It was the space it left behind. After the files were sealed and the evidence boxed for the last time, the people closest to the case learned something uncomfortable. Answers don't arrive all at once. They drip. Slowly. Inconsistently. And when they stop, you're left not with certainty, but with an outline of something you'll never fully see. Her name stayed in records. In databases. In quiet conversations between investigators who would never forget the cadence of that night. But for everyone else, life continued the way it always does. Forward, indifferent, unburdened by unresolved questions. The man in prison grew older. His hair thinned. His hands shook when he wrote. Medical reports replaced legal ones. He was transferred twice, each move shrinking his world further. The notoriety faded. New inmates didn't recognize his name. Guards stopped associating him with the case unless prompted. This more than sentencing seemed to affect him, because anonymity was never part of his plan. A prison chaplain visited him once a week. Not to extract confession. Not to offer absolution. Just to sit. Over time, the chaplain noticed something strange. He spoke less about himself and more about the moment. That night. Always circling it. Never landing. One decision, he said once. That's all it was. The chaplain asked which one. He didn't answer. In the outside world, the road remained unchanged. People still pulled over there, sometimes without thinking. Still trusted the lights behind them. Still believed that danger announced itself clearly, that evil wore obvious faces. That belief was the quiet legacy of the case. Not fear but misplaced confidence. Her family moved away from Texas. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just gradually. A job change. A house sold. Distance put between them and the road, the quarry, the ditch. They took her with them in photographs and stories that no longer centered on how she died, but how she lived. They stopped following updates. They had learned the cost. Years later, a graduate student researching cold cases requested access to the sealed files for an academic review. The request was denied. Too sensitive. Too settled. Too much potential for reopening wounds that had never truly closed. Instead, the student interviewed retired investigators. One of them said something that never made it into the paper. "We think justice is an answer," he said. "But it's really just a boundary. It tells you where you have to stop looking." The student asked if he thought the full truth was ever known. The investigator shook his head. "No," he said. But enough of it was. That was the quiet consensus. Enough. Enough to know she didn't vanish by choice. Enough to know trust was used as a weapon. Enough to know the silence that followed wasn't accidental. But not enough to erase the unease. Because cases like this don't just haunt families or towns. They haunt assumptions. They remind people that evil doesn't always rush in. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it speaks calmly. Sometimes it wears authority and patience and familiarity. Sometimes it asks you to pull over. The plaque by the road weathered. The letters faded. Someone repainted the name once. Someone else removed a wilted bouquet. No ceremonies followed. No anniversaries marked publicly. The story didn't need them. It lived on in the pauses. In the moments when people hesitated before stopping at night. In the instinct to double-check mirrors. In the quiet understanding that not every danger announces itself with noise. And somewhere behind concrete and wire, a man lived out his days knowing one thing he could never control again. The ending. Because the ground spoke. The silence broke. And the story moved on without him. Cold cases don't end with answers. They end with echoes. And this one. This Texas road, this night in 1988. This trust that never came back. Still echoes. Not loudly. Not clearly. But enough. Enough to remind anyone listening that some truths don't arrive as revelations. They arrive as absences. And they stay. The echo didn't fade. It changed shape. Years after the case slipped from headlines, it resurfaced in quieter places. Training rooms, policy briefings, whispered conversations between officers who had learned to distrust routine. The road in Texas became a reference point not by name but by lesson. This is how it happens. Not with chaos. With compliance. Academies began telling the story without telling it. Recruits were warned about impersonation, about how authority can be mimicked with frightening ease. They were shown how a light bar can be bought, how confidence can be rehearsed, how trust can be manufactured in seconds and weaponized for decades. No one mentioned her name. But she was there. In every pause, every cautionary slide, every reminder that procedure is only as strong as the people who respect it. The man in prison grew quieter still. His medical file thickened. His world narrowed to medication schedules and institutional routines. On one of his last evaluations, a psychologist asked him if he felt misunderstood. He shook his head. "I was understood too late," he said. It wasn't remorse. It was disappointment. The psychologist wrote that down. Outside, the land continued its slow erasure. Rain softened edges. Weeds reclaimed paths. The ditch where she was found filled and drained and filled again, indifferent to the attention it once received. The quarry, fenced and posted, remained empty, holding secrets it would never be asked to give up again. People forgot details. They forgot dates. Forgot exact charges. Forgot the legal nuance. What they didn't forget was the feeling. That tightness in the chest when thinking about stopping at night. That second glance at flashing lights in the mirror. That awareness that safety is sometimes a performance. The case became a warning passed along without attribution. A story told without an ending. One winter morning years later, a maintenance worker found the plaque by the road cracked down the middle. Weather damage. Normal wear. He considered reporting it, then decided against it. Instead, he propped it upright, brushed off the dirt, and left it as it was. Broken but standing. In prison, the man was moved to the infirmary. He no longer asked for books. No longer followed news. When the chaplain visited for the last time, he asked if there was anything he wanted said on his behalf. The man thought for a long time. Then he said no. He died quietly. No press release followed. No renewed interest. Just a line added to a record, noting the date and time. The case status didn't change. It had already given everything it was going to give. But death has a way of reopening silence. Without him, there were no more narratives to manage, no more letters, no more maps. What remained was fixed. Unchangeable. The truth, such as it was, could no longer be negotiated. Investigators who had worked the case met once more, informally. No agenda. No notes. They spoke about what they'd learned. About patience. About humility. About how time can both reveal and erase. One of them said something that stayed. Some cases don't teach you how to solve crimes, he said. They teach you how to listen. Listen to what isn't said. Listen to what feels ordinary. Listen to silence. Because silence isn't empty. It's full of things people chose not to notice. The road remains open. Cars still pull over. Lives still intersect briefly and then move apart. Most nights pass without incident. Most trust goes unrewarded but unpunished. Until it isn't. And that's the final truth the case leaves behind. Not fear. Not closure. But awareness. That evil doesn't always arrive as a rupture. Sometimes it arrives as a request. A gesture. A light in the mirror. And when it's over, when the ground has spoken and the courts have closed and the story has exhausted itself, what remains is not an answer. It's a question. One that lingers in the quiet of Texas nights, in the hum of tires on asphalt, in the moment someone considers pulling over and wonders, just for a second, who is really behind them? Time did what it always does. It moved on without permission. New houses rose where fields once stretched. Streetlights were replaced, brighter, colder, less forgiving of shadow. The highway was repaved, lane markings sharpened, shoulders widened. On paper, the road became safer. Statistically improved. Progress documented in municipal reports that never mentioned what had happened there decades earlier. But memory doesn't follow zoning laws. For those who knew the case, the stretch of asphalt still carried weight. Not visible. Not measurable. Just a pressure that settled in the chest when driving alone at night. When red and blue reflections flickered across the windshield. When the body reacted before the mind could catch up. It wasn't panic. It was recognition. Somewhere in a county office, a box remained unopened. Not sealed evidence, not legally relevant. Just personal effects returned long ago. Then misplaced, then rediscovered during a routine inventory. A receipt. A keychain. A faded note with a phone number that no longer connected to anything. The clerk held the items for a moment, felt their unfamiliar gravity, then logged them and sent them back into storage. Objects outlive meaning. Meaning outlives answers. The case continued to circulate quietly online.
Forum. Comment section.
Amateur timelines built from fragments and speculation. Some users were convinced the truth had never fully surfaced. Others argued it didn't matter anymore. Justice, they said, had been served. They debated tone.
Motive.
Procedure. They never debated the night itself. Because the night was fixed. A woman alone. A car pulled over. A figure stepping out of the darkness with confidence, with purpose, with no reason to be questioned. Every theory eventually collapsed back into that moment. The point of no return. A journalist once tried to revisit the story for an anniversary piece. She drove the route herself, windows down, recorder off. She expected to feel something dramatic. Fear. Sadness. Anger. What she felt instead was unease. The kind that doesn't spike. The kind that spreads. She never wrote the article. She said later that the case didn't want to be reopened. That it resisted narrative. That every attempt to give it shape felt like an intrusion, like forcing order onto something that thrived in disorder. What haunted her wasn't what happened. It was how easily it could happen again. Technology changed. Protocols tightened. Training improved. But trust remained necessary. And trust, by definition, is a risk. In a classroom somewhere, a criminology professor used the case as a footnote. Not as a headline. A brief mention while discussing offender psychology and delayed arrests. A student asked if it bothered him that the case was never fully resolved. The professor paused. Resolution is a luxury, he said. Most victims don't get it. Most families don't get it. Society just learns to live around the absence. The student wrote that down. Outside the classroom, life continued. People fell in love. People argued. People drove home late after long shifts, tired, distracted, eager for routine to carry them safely through the night. And most nights it did. That was the cruel balance. The case didn't define Texas. It didn't define law enforcement. It didn't define the era. It existed alongside everything else. Quiet, persistent, unresolved in all the ways that matter. Sometimes, late at night, a dispatcher would receive a call from a driver asking to confirm whether an unmarked vehicle behind them was legitimate. These calls were handled professionally, efficiently, without drama. But every time the same thought passed through the room. This is why. This is what lingers. Not the crime scene photos. Not the transcripts. Not the verdict. The instinct to verify. The hesitation before compliance. The momentary resistance to authority when something feels off. That instinct saved lives. It was learned the hard way. The case never asked to be remembered. It didn't need anniversaries or documentaries or dramatic reenactments. It worked in the background, reshaping behavior in small, almost invisible ways. A second look. A longer pause. A choice to call someone before stopping. And that may have been its only resolution. Not closure. Impact. Because some stories don't end when the credits roll. They end when behavior changes. And even then they don't really end. They settle. Into the asphalt. Into the night. Into the space between flashing lights and the decision to trust them. Waiting. Silent. Unfinished. The waiting became the story. Not an act of suspense, not a countdown, but a low, constant presence, like humidity in the air. Invisible yet undeniable. The case no longer moved forward, but it didn't recede either. It occupied a fixed point in time, a gravity well that bent everything around it just slightly. People who hadn't been born in 1988 now drove that road. They knew nothing about her. Nothing about the night. Nothing about the man who waited decades before being named. And still the case touched them. In subtle ways. A delayed decision. A call made instead of silence. A refusal to roll down the window all the way. Institutional memory is strange like that. It doesn't require facts. Survives on instinct. Passed down through policy changes, procedural updates, half-remembered warnings spoken by older officers to younger ones who don't ask where the caution comes from. Verify first. Trust your gut. Don't assume. No footnotes attached. Somewhere in an archive, audio tapes from early interviews slowly degraded. Magnetic hiss crept into the silences between questions and answers. Voices blurred. Edges softened. Eventually, even if someone wanted to listen again, the sound would no longer be clean enough to trust. The evidence aged. So did the memories. Witnesses who once spoke with certainty began to doubt themselves. Was it that night or another? That car or a similar one? Time rearranged recollection until even truth felt negotiable. That was the quiet cruelty of the delay. Not just that justice waited, but that reality itself began to fray. One former investigator admitted years later that he stopped revisiting the case not because it hurt, but because it tempted him. Every time he looked back, he found himself wanting to adjust something, reinterpret a detail, fix an error with hindsight. That's how you rewrite history, he said, by convincing yourself it needed help. So he stopped. Let it stand. Let it be incomplete. The family, now scattered across states, rarely spoke about the case in public. When asked, they kept their answers short. Polite. Controlled. They had learned that curiosity often disguised itself as concern, that questions came with expectations they could never satisfy. They were expected to feel relief. They didn't. They felt distance. From the night. From the coverage. From the version of her that existed only as a victim. Their grief had moved on, even if the case hadn't. On anniversaries, there were no statements. No calls for renewed tips. The silence wasn't neglect. It was preservation. A way of keeping the memory from being flattened into a symbol or a lesson or a headline recycled for relevance. Because to them, she was none of those things. She was specific. And specificity doesn't survive spectacle. In law enforcement circles, the case was occasionally cited as a success story. A long-delayed arrest. Persistence rewarded. Proof that time doesn't protect guilt forever. But even there, the praise was cautious. Everyone understood the cost. Decades of uncertainty. A life defined by absence. A truth assembled too late to heal anything it touched. Success, yes. Satisfaction, no. The road absorbed it all. Every retelling. Every footnote. Every unspoken thought of this could have been prevented. Tires passed over the same stretch of asphalt where it began, grinding memory into dust that scattered and resettled. At night, the road looked like any other. That was the most unsettling part. No marker of danger. No scar. No warning. Just darkness and the assumption that darkness is empty. The case challenged that assumption. It suggested that danger doesn't always announce itself, that it can exist comfortably within normalcy, borrowing its shape, wearing its language, waiting patiently for compliance. That idea outlived everyone involved. It became cultural residue, a faint distortion in how people understand safety. And distortions, once introduced, don't disappear. They persist. In the way hands tighten on the wheel, in the way eyes track mirrors, in the way silence suddenly feels loud when flashing lights appear behind you on an empty road. The case never asked for that legacy, but it left it anyway. Because unresolved stories don't fade. They sink. And once they're part of the ground, every step above them carries their weight. Unnoticed, unmeasured, but always there. By the 15th year after the arrest, the case no longer belonged to any one place. It had detached. It lived in training manuals without names, in warnings given without context, in instincts that surfaced without explanation. It became portable, adaptable, able to fit into any dark stretch of road, any quiet stop, any moment where authority and vulnerability met alone. That was its final transformation. From event to pattern. The original files were moved again, deeper into storage, their labels updated to reflect status rather than story. Closed. Resolved. Words that looked definitive on paper but felt hollow when spoken aloud. Those who handled the boxes noticed how light they were. Paper weighs less when time has stripped it of urgency. But lightness didn't mean insignificance. It meant the burden had shifted. From evidence to memory. From courts to culture. From facts to behavior. Somewhere, a young officer pulled over a vehicle late at night and felt a flicker of hesitation before approaching. He couldn't name why. He followed protocol carefully, exaggerated his visibility, announced every movement. The stop ended uneventfully. He drove away thinking nothing of it. He never knew why he was cautious. But the case was there. A woman driving alone chose not to stop immediately when lights appeared behind her. She slowed, turned on her hazards, called emergency services to confirm the stop. The dispatcher reassured her. Everything proceeded safely. Later, she apologized to the officer for the delay. He told her not to. That exchange never made the news. Didn't need to. These were the quiet victories, invisible and uncounted, built on the ruins of something that should never have happened. The case had finally begun to give back. Not through answers but through prevention. And yet the unease remained. Because for all the lessons learned, one truth stayed fixed. It worked once. That knowledge couldn't be undone. The man who committed the crime was gone, but the method endured. The realization that trust could be so easily redirected, that normalcy could be weaponized, settled uncomfortably into public consciousness. No arrest could erase that. In academic circles, the case was occasionally cited as an example of delayed accountability. Panels discuss forensic advances, database evolution, the patience of cold case units. They spoke of progress. But in the margins of those discussions, another question hovered. What about the years in between? The decades where nothing moved. The time when the truth existed but remained unreachable. The lives lived under the assumption that the worst was already over. That gap was never addressed. It couldn't be. Because gaps are not problems to be solved. They are spaces to be endured. For the family, endurance had become routine. They mark time differently now. Not by anniversaries of loss, but by the accumulation of ordinary days. Birthdays celebrated without hesitation. Conversations that no longer circled back to the case. Healing, they learned, didn't require resolution. It required permission to move forward without it. The case faded further into abstraction. New crimes replaced it in the public imagination. New fears took precedence. Attention shifted, as it always does. But abstraction didn't mean disappearance. It meant diffusion. The story spread thinly across countless moments where someone hesitated, verified, questioned. Moments where instinct overruled assumption. Where safety was treated not as a given but as a process. That was the residue of the case. Not horror. Not fascination. Vigilance. And vigilance, unlike fear, is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It integrates. It becomes part of how people move through the world, altering behavior without demanding recognition. The road in Texas continued to absorb miles. The night continued to fall. Lights continued to flash behind drivers who trusted, questioned, delayed, complied. Most encounters ended safely. That was the goal. That was the change. And yet, somewhere beneath the asphalt, beneath the policies and protocols and carefully worded lessons, the original story remained intact. Not softened. Not redeemed. Waiting. Because unresolved cases don't ask to be remembered. They insist. They persist as reminders that certainty is fragile, that time is not justice, that answers can arrive too late to matter to the people who needed them most. And as long as that truth remains uncomfortable, the case will never truly be over. It will simply grow quieter, sharper, more deeply embedded in the choices people make when no one is watching and the road ahead looks empty. Especially then. In the end, the case did not conclude. It settled. Like dust after a collapse, it drifted slowly, invisibly, coating everything it touched until the world adjusted around it. No single moment marked its disappearance. No final headline declared it finished. It simply stopped being spoken aloud and continued being felt. That was how it survived. The road in Texas never changed its name. Maps didn't mark it differently. GPS directions carried drivers across it without hesitation, without warning, without memory. On screens, it was just another line connecting two places, stripped of the weight it carried in real life. But memory doesn't need signs. It embeds itself elsewhere. In training rooms where instructors pause for half a second longer than necessary. In dispatch centers where calls are double-checked instead of assumed. In the tone officers use when approaching vehicles at night, careful to be seen, careful to be known. All of it traces back to one quiet decision made decades earlier. One moment where authority was trusted because it looked familiar. One moment where danger didn't rush, didn't threaten, didn't reveal itself. It simply waited to be accepted. The case taught that lesson better than any manual ever could. Years later, someone asked a retired detective if the arrest brought him peace. He considered the question carefully, then shook his head. Peace implies balance, he said. This never balanced out. What it brought was containment. The harm was limited. The truth was partially recovered. The silence was interrupted. But balance was never restored. Because nothing could give back what was taken, or return the world to the version that existed before the night proved how thin the line between safety and danger really was. The family understood that before anyone else. They had learned that justice is not the opposite of loss. It simply stands beside it, unable to cancel it out. They carried both forward quietly without spectacle, without commentary. Their resilience never became a headline. Didn't need to. The case didn't want attention anymore. It had already done its work. Its impact no longer depended on recognition, only on repetition, small, unseen repetitions of caution and awareness played out across countless ordinary nights. That was its final form. Not a story people retold. A reflex people inherited. Somewhere, a driver sees flashing lights in the mirror and slows instead of stopping abruptly. Somewhere, a dispatcher confirms a badge number without being asked. Somewhere, an officer announces himself clearly, consciously, knowing visibility matters as much as authority. None of them think about Texas. None of them think about 1988. None of them know her name. And yet, they are responding to her absence. That is how cold cases end. Not with answers. Not with relief. But with changes so subtle they feel like instinct. The man responsible is gone. The files are closed. The evidence rests in boxes that may never be opened again. The legal system has reached its limit. But the case remains active in another way. In the space between trust and verification. In the moment before compliance. In the understanding that normal can be dangerous and danger can look normal. That understanding is the echo. It doesn't fade. It doesn't demand attention. It simply waits, quietly shaping behavior, quietly preventing repetition, quietly reminding anyone who's listening that some stories don't end when they're solved. They end when they stop needing to be told. And even then, they never really leave. They stay in the night, on the road, in the mirror, watching, silent, unfinished. Not the kind that follows a verdict or a sentence, but the deeper silence that settles when there is nothing left to pursue and no one left to question. It filled the gaps where speculation once lived, Where outrage once burned hot enough to demand answers, what replaced it wasn't peace. It was acceptance without comfort. The case had crossed its last threshold. There were no more appeals to file, no evidence left to test, no names left to surface. The timeline was fixed now, its sharp edges dulled by repetition, its uncertainties no longer contested but quietly acknowledged. Everyone involved understood the same thing without needing to say it out loud. This was as complete as it was ever going to get. In small towns across Texas, stories change as they're passed down. Details shift. Motives blur. But this one resisted distortion. Not because it was preserved carefully, but because it was too simple at its core.
No elaborate conspiracy. No dramatic chase.
Just a moment where ordinary behavior intersected with extraordinary intent. That simplicity made it harder to forget. Because it offered no distance. Anyone could see themselves there. Anyone could recognize the choice. Anyone could understand how little time it took. That was why the case never became folklore. Folklore softens edges. This did not. It stayed raw in the collective subconscious, stripped of embellishment, defined by absence rather than spectacle. The absence of warning. The absence of escape. The absence of certainty even decades later. At conferences, when professionals spoke about the case, their voices lowered without intention. Not out of reverence but caution. As if raising their tone might cheapen what had been learned at such cost. They spoke about vigilance. About verification. About the danger of assumptions. They never spoke about closure. Closure implied symmetry. This had none. Somewhere, a file clerk stamped a document and slid it into a drawer, completing a task without knowing what it belonged to. Somewhere else, a journalist deleted a draft that didn't feel right. Somewhere else still, a family chose not to correct a stranger who got the details wrong. None of these moments mattered on their own. Together, they formed the afterlife of the case. An existence defined not by action but by restraint. By what people chose not to do. Not to assume. Not to rush. Not to trust blindly. That restraint became the legacy. And legacies don't announce themselves. They blend in. The road continued to carry traffic. Nights passed without incident. Most people never felt the shadow at all. That was proof that the world had absorbed the lesson and kept moving. But absorption doesn't mean erasure. It means the lesson has sunk so deep it no longer needs to be named. That is how unresolved cases finally rest. Not when every question is answered, but when the remaining questions stop demanding attention and start shaping behavior instead. When the mystery no longer pulls people backward, but quietly pushes them to be more careful going forward. The case no longer asks anything of the living. It has already taken what it needed. All that remains is the echo, no longer loud, no longer sharp but steady. A low-frequency reminder embedded in the background of everyday life. Audible only to those who know how to listen. And sometimes, late at night, when the road is empty and the mirror fills with light, people do listen. They slow down. They think. They choose differently. They never know why. They just do. That is where the story ends, not with a revelation, not with justice fully served, but with a quiet shift in human behavior that traces back to one night, one road, one decision that could never be undone. The case does not need another chapter. It has become part of the world. And the world, whether it realizes it or not, has learned to live with it. What finally remains is not memory, but inheritance. The case no longer belongs to those who lived through it, investigated it, or reported on it. It belongs to people who will never hear its name, never read its files, never know the weight it once carried. They inherit only its consequences, folded invisibly into the world they move through. That is how the story survives. Not as a warning spoken aloud, but as an instinct that activates without explanation. A hesitation that feels personal. A doubt that arrives without context. A pause that lasts just long enough to change the outcome. The original night has lost its sharpness in time, but not its relevance. It no longer shocks. It no longer dominates conversation. Instead, it operates quietly, like a background process running beneath ordinary life, influencing decisions without demanding attention. That is its final power. Because fear fades, but habit endures. The systems that absorb the lesson continue to evolve. Procedures refine. Technology advances, yet the core vulnerability remains untouched. Human trust, human compliance, the assumption that order implies safety. The case never argued against trust. It argued for awareness. And awareness, once learned, never fully disappears. Somewhere, a young dispatcher hears uncertainty in a caller's voice and chooses to verify rather than reassure too quickly. Somewhere, an officer makes himself visible before making himself authoritative. Somewhere, a driver keeps their doors locked and their phone in hand until certainty replaces assumption. None of these moments are dramatic. None of them are recorded. They don't become stories. They become outcomes that never happen. That is the quiet arithmetic of prevention. The case fades further each year, not because it is forgotten, but because it is no longer needed as a reference point. Its lesson has been absorbed into the fabric of behavior, no longer requiring its origin story to function. That is when a cold case truly ends. Not when it is solved, not when it is punished, but when its absence begins to protect others. Still, the original truth remains unchanged. One night, one road, one decision that was trusted when it should not have been. Nothing redeems that. Nothing balances it. Time does not soften it. It only redistributes its weight. The world carries that weight now, spread thinly across countless small acts of caution and restraint. So thin that most people never feel it directly. So effective that most never realize it is there. That is the paradox. The more successful the lesson becomes, the less visible the story is. And so the case finally dissolves, not into answers, not into peace, but into the background of everyday life, where it does its work silently, persistently, without recognition. The road remains. The night returns. The mirror fills with light. And somewhere in that moment, a choice is made differently than it once was. That difference is the ending. Not a conclusion. A continuation. Carried forward by people who will never know why they pause, why they verify, why they refuse to assume. They just do. And because they do, the story no longer needs to be told. It has already changed the world enough.